demand avoidance phenomena / pathological or extreme demand avoidance in brackets. It's 4 schools of thought and how you may conceptualize it by Mr. Richard Woods, PhD student at London South Bank University. This is a test recording for a talk I will be delivering on the 18th of November 2021 to the Chat Lab at University of Sussex. So, yeah, as it is a test recording, this might be slightly different to the actual talk that I deliver because I only meant to talk for about half hour on the 18th, so the final talk might be edited down from this version. So, yeah. A bit about me and my perspective. So, I am autistic. I was diagnosed with autism in 2012. I do meet Elizabeth Neeson's behaviour profile for the Demand-Avoidance Phenomena. I'm just going to call it Pathological Demand Avoidance, or PDA, because it just makes it easier for people to understand when watching this video. I'm not emotionally attached to PDA as a construct, and it should be quite obvious from people engaging with with my work, such as this video. So, yeah, there's a quite recent paper by Monique Bertha, which is asking kind of people who read and write about autism to reflect on how their values shape their understandings and shape their construction of autistic people. I think that this quote is equally applicable for those who are reading and writing about PDA. So, yeah, my agenda is for there to be at least inclusive, good quality, scientific, method-based research and practice around PDA. I'm quite critical that I think a lot of the PDA research and practice is not scientific. That's a kind of tangent. Yeah, personally, I favour a transdiagnostic approach to dealing with and managing kind of and mapping out individual characteristics that are often described in kind of mental disorders. I think we should be aspiring to stop using mental disorders in kind of clinical practice and research over the next few decades. My PhD is in investigating PDA, and I am part of the Critical Autism / Disability Studies group at London South Bank University. Something which I'll get onto later is that presently the evidence base of PDA is so poor and so small that there's no conclusive evidence to suggest what PDA is or what it might be. So this is essentially my interpretation of the literature, and I should be quite clear about that from the outset, so that others might disagree with me. So I have a few comments of interest to kind of just note. So when I have been developing various tools for PDA, such as the Pathological Demand Avoidance Belief Scale, and I do earn some income from delivering training sessions on PDA. I'm also reluctantly advocates for diagnosing PDA as a standalone construct. So, yeah, this is just a brief overview of what I shall be covering. So, the current situation with PDA in the UK, the kind of history of Elizabeth Neeson's PDA research, and then the kind of various histories of its 4 main schools of thought, which involve viewing PDA as a profile of autism spectrum disorder, rebranded autism, that PDA might be a pseudo-syndrome, and that it might be a common mental disorder. And then I'll be briefly discussing why these different outlooks matter, and for presenting very briefly how I'm currently kind of modelling and defining PDA. Then I'll just be briefly kind of mentioning potential discussion topics which I could have after the half-hour talk. Yeah, there are plenty of images and tables in this talk, and there's quite a lot of information. So I think people should kind of take the time with it and kind of take the time in listening to it and kind of processing what I'm trying to convey. So yeah. At the moment, presently in UK, there is a main discourse on PDA. So it's often called pathological demand avoidance or extreme demand avoidance, and it was originally viewed as a pervasive developmental disorder. And it's being argued that it's a rare autism subtype, profile, or subgroup. In clinical practice, these are essentially the same thing. It's argued that PDA has different strategies compared to autism, and I can kind of cover the. I've got various discussion topics that I can include to talk in the kind of half hour after the kind of my talking section of the talk on the 18th, but I won't actually be going through the potential discussion topics later in this video. So yeah, about PDA itself, it's as a diagnostic entity, so as constructed, it is currently unstable. There's no consensus over what it is or what it looks like. There's a general approach to kind of reducing down the PDA traits down to those that are essential for a diagnosis. And also there's no consensus over how to do it. There's 5 different kind of PDA profiles that are in print. I don't have time to go into them. I'm just going to have to kind of reference them here. So this is currently how I kind of present PDA to people when kind of talking about it. So left-hand side is basically the autism DSM-5 criteria, and the right-hand side is the aggregated PDA profile. So I've taken all the traits from the other PDA profiles in the literature and kind of put them together into one. So the 2 areas that overlap between PDA and autism, which is slight and social communication areas, and that's because PDA have no theory of mind deficits, while some autistic people do pass theory of mind tests. And at the bottom is that PDA is meant to have multiple developmental features, and they are generic in nature, and they overlap features that are seen in autism. But there is differences in the kind of quantity of kind of social communication issues and developmental issues, and kind of restricted and repetitive behaviours and interests in both PDA and autism. And I don't have the RRBIs for PDA and autism overlapping because the ones in PDA are meant to be due to high anxiety levels, and anxiety is clinically recognised to not be an autism feature. So kind of moving on to the next bit. So yeah, it's recognised that people who are a lot of the prominent researchers on PDA in the UK are researching it from their understandings of autism, and that caregivers are often highly motivated to take part in PDA research, and this is PDA research that views it to be part of the autism spectrum. So more recently, it's been acknowledged that PDA in itself is a cultural-based construct to the UK, which I think is quite problematic. Again, another comment that like interest in UK and PDA as a form of autism has significantly outstripped its evidence base. Yeah, it's also been noted in the PDA literature originally by others, but I've kind of expanded on to point out that the campaigning efforts to kind of have PDA recognised as part of the autism spectrum can lead to people being on the lookout and for PDA, and it is a potential source of bias. So yeah, should there be this bubble for the kind of PDA profile of autism? And the answer in my view is quite clearly no. The proponents of PDA as a form of autism would argue that the bubble should be, or that PDA should be recognised all the way across the globe, from my understanding of their views. The PDA literature is quite clear that PDA itself is a controversial construct, and it is for many different reasons. I don't have time to go into why it's controversial, but the reasons for why it's controversial are listed in the further discussion points. More recently, over the summer of 2021, 3 kind of independent, reputable kind of parties have kind of looked at PDA and its evidence base and concluded that there's no evidence to suggest what PDA is or what it could be, and they have treated divergent opinion on the topic equally. And this is including NICE, which is kind of a body that practitioners and researchers on PDA should be at least mimicking its approach to PDA. So yeah, I can also go into great detail why PDA is not part of the autism spectrum in the kind of Q&A section, which I won't discuss in the video, but it's the slides are there. So yeah, PDA itself has been quite robustly and consistently challenged over almost 20 years time period, and this has kind of led there to being much debate in the PDA literature about what it could be. And so there's kind of 3 other main schools of thought that are knocking around in the academic discourse around PDA. So the first one is that it's a common mental disorder. The second one is that it's rebranded autism, and the final one is that it's a pseudo-syndrome that is basically symptoms resulted from the interaction between autism and co-occurring conditions in autistic persons. So to kind of emphasise there is no consensus about it, there are multiple different diagnostic thresholds of PDA in the literature, and each kind of diagnostic threshold will kind of have a kind of predicted kind of prevalence rate. It's very hard to kind of compare the diagnostic thresholds in kind of PDA in the literature. What I need to point out is that from Weatel higher is PDA just exclusive to autistic persons, and around the EDAQ/DSM-5 OCD threshold, PDA is not pervasive in nature. So in order to kind of help me kind of differentiate between different, the diagnostic thresholds in print, I've kind of asked a few questions to kind of systematically investigate them from a kind of theoretical perspective. So yeah, so I've asked, is demand avoidance pervasive at that threshold? Does demand avoidance have to present from early infancy? Does the person have to be autistic to receive a PDA diagnosis? Are the core 5 traits present? And by the core 5 traits, I mean the anxiety-based RBIs. So, and I'll go back later, and I also have to ask, are coding issues have to be present to receive a diagnosis for PDA? Encoding issues is, well, I'll get onto definitions for that later. But I just want to point out that these are the 5 traits on PDA. Is the core ones are kind of comfortable role-playing, pretend, continues to resist and avoid order demands of life, the ability of mood, so this is kind of extreme rapid changes in mood, meant to be by the need for control, like obsessive behaviour and kind of strategies for and social strategies of avoidance that are essentially manipulative. So yeah. Going on to, this is a quick overview of Elizabeth Newson's PDA research, and she was the clinician who discovered or created PDA, depending on your outlook and perspective. I'm not going to go into this great detail, but it's important to be aware of kind of key dates and key kind of aspects of it. So she started data collecting her kind of cases for a cohort in 1975, and she did it over like a 25-year time period. She first kind of proposes PDA in a lecture in 1980 based on 12 cases, and she chooses the name Pathological Demand Avoidance Syndrome. She kind of discusses PDA in print for the first time in 1983, and she quite clearly states that PDA is not autism and that she doesn't like the name for it, which itself is quite interesting. And I'll kind of go into the kind of bits around Newton's diagnostic groupings after this. But it's kind of important to know that she created a diagnostic grouping first before creating its behaviour profile. And I kind of cover the sharp rise in the number of cases in a moment. But yeah, there's quite a long time period over which Newton kind of investigates PDA and gathers research for it, and she conducts a few studies into it, which she kind of talks about. This is basically Newton's cohort size over time, so from 1975 to year 2000, and it's kind of important because in the moment in the literature, it's kind of been argued, to help to explain the differences between PDA and autism, is that Newton's cohort mainly contains persons who have like kind of like severe presentations of PDA and autism, because Newton's clinic didn't really receive cases of kind of mild autism or PDA or kind of Asperger's and stuff. Graph is important because it kind of shows that this argument, the logic behind why there might be a collider bias present, is basically a bit of nonsense. So if you make a simple graph, you should see that there's a sharp rise around from 1988 from any kind of Newton's kind of cohort going up from 36 to 115 in about 12 years. So before then, so after 1988 is basically the amount of participants being recruited each year basically triples. And the reasons for this is, one is because of the growth and recognition in kind of Asperger's syndrome in the UK and globally happens in late 1980s, and also that the autism spectrum itself is obviously broadened to include Asperger's syndrome. The second reason is that Newton created a behaviour profile in 1988, and therefore she has a common reference point to diagnose PDA. So So this is Newton's first behavioural profile she created in 1986. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it because I've got another video on it, but kind of key points to make is that she calls it pervasive mental coding disorders. She got autism on the top left, PDA top right, and on the bottom there's dysphagia and dyslexia. The autism one has Asperger's in there. It's because she's got a bar for kind of intellectual kind of potential at the bottom, but she kind of used the kind of the milder version of it to be kind of Asperger's, the more severe form to be kind of autism and stuff. Yeah, so what she used this diagram for kind of 10 years, and it's important to note that she created this diagnostic grouping. It doesn't exist anywhere else from my understanding. So she revised this diagnostic grouping to kind of fit within kind of more accepted kind of norms. So what she's done is she's kind of dropped dyslexia and dysphagia a bit and kind of folded them into a specific language impairment here. Increased kind of PDA out to kind of discuss some of his more symptoms, and just kind of folded out Asperger's own distinct thing at the top and kind of just autistic disorder at the bottom. I'm not entirely sure when she created this, but it's in a document from 1999. But this is a transitional one. This document is important, which I'll get into later actually. But this is the final one from Newton et al. 2003, which is the peer-reviewed article version of it. And there is some slight differences between the two, but the main one she's done is she's fully included specific language impairment. And that's quite important if you kind of analyse this diagram and kind of compare it to accepted definitions of pervasive mental disorders and a specific kind of grouping of that within the DSM-5, within the DSM-4. So yeah, it's quite problematic fitting Newton's work into accepted diagnostic groupings and diagnostic practice. But I don't have time to go into, so this again can be covered in the Q&A section. And it is in a different talk itself, which is kind of linked at the end. So these are the definitions which kind of Newton's using consistently across these three diagnostic groupings, which are essentially the same. Is pervasive, which suggests that the effects can be seen in other child's development. Developmental means that the disorder is present at birth and gradually becomes apparent during the course of development. Disorder implies more than straightforward delay and coding issues, which is basically not pressing or understanding certain aspects of communication. There are problems with these definitions and with PDA meeting these definitions, which are kind of covered in the slides at the end. I haven't actually discussed these issues in a video, so that's what I'm going to be doing in December, is making a video for why these four definitions are problematic and why it's problematic PDA conforming to them. So this is a brief overview of the history of the PDA profile of autism, and it's kind of important because Newton didn't view PDA to be part of the autism spectrum. She viewed it to be something else, and she quite clearly said that it's not autism. It first viewed as being part of the autism spectrum in 2007 by Phil Christie imprint, and what he did is he argued it by referencing this 1999 diagram, and all his kind of conference talks, from understanding, used this diagram when kind of arguing for PDA to be autism, because what he argues is that the diagnostic group and pervasive mental disorders have been replaced with autism spectrum disorder, which is kind of true and also kind of not. But yeah, there's other kind of key bits of information. So this table is quite important because you cannot really separate out the kind of the campaigning to how PDA recognised from as a part of the autism spectrum and kind of research that supports being a form of autism, because a lot of the key literature is either connected to the PDA Development Group, which is a committee that was set up in 2011 to kind of push this agenda to make PDA become accepted as part of the autism spectrum. It either has members directly involved with the PDA Development Group in the research, or is kind of collaborating with them. So there's a political aspect to the kind of research and the kind of campaigning efforts. And then kind of important things to kind of note, so like Gordon Asher Smith saying that PDA might be a female form of autism, which I do need to note was also kind of stated in the editorial comment on Christie 2007. But yeah, there's kind of other kind of key points to say. So like NAS formally recognises PDA as part of autism spectrum 2015. last bit I'm going to draw attention to is more recently PDA Society, which is a charity that views PDA to be part of the autism spectrum, is saying that it's working with kind of local government and national government to have PDA recognised as part of the autism spectrum and that kind of side of it. There are multiple issues with this. One of the main ones being is that PDA itself is not referenced in the kind of the England in the 2021 England autism strategy, and it's the same situation with the previous two versions of the autism strategy. So yeah, this is a bit of the history for rebranded autism, and this kind of gives you a bit more overview of kind of debates around it academically. And what this basically means is that PDA represents features that are not that are typically not pathologized in an autism diagnosis. So it kind of pathologizes other aspects of a person as part of an autism diagnosis process when you're including a PDA in that diagnosis. So it mainly seems to come out of about from comments by Lorna Wing and Judy Gore in 2002, which they say that PDA is not a syndrome. It just its features are seen throughout the autistic population. These comments are both picked up in Christie 2007 and in Milton 2017. Yeah, there's a recurring theme that basically no feature of PDA is specific to PDA itself. That its features are kind of seen in other kind of clinical kind of groups and kind of diagnostic entities. One of the main comments about this kind of school of thought is that most of it comes from critical autism studies scholars like myself, and we will often comment that basically PDA represents the pathologizing of persons trying to express their self-agency, especially when distressed. And this is kind of work that Damien Milton's kind of done. I've built upon, and Alison Moore has also kind of built upon more recently. So this is just a diagram by Alison Moore from 2019. So PDA just represents a person kind of transgressing kind of various cultural norms, kind of especially gender norms, and the person tends to be autistic because it's mainly diagnosed in autistic children at the moment. But it's sorry, I'm going off on one. I'm trying to stay on topic. So yeah, this is the brief history overview of PDA as a pseudo-syndrome, and by this I mean its features are basically its constituent features can be represented from other accepted from accepted constructs. PDA itself is not a recognised or accepted diagnostic entity or disorder at the moment. So kind of goes by from kind of comments on Nathan's original research that a cohort seems to have signs of ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, and kind of social anxiety disorder, and kind of precursors for schizotypal disorder. It kind of goes on to this, so that PDA might be a double hit or triple hit of kind of other kind of constructs and autism. And this is kind of a recurring theme that's kind of mentioned in the PDA literature, that PDA seems to represent kind of features that are seen outside of autism, and there's often kind of the same things coming up. So kind of like oppositional defiant disorder, kind of conduct problems, hyperactivity, kind of mood disorders. So yeah, I'm going to kind of just end this discussion table by basically saying that, for example, NICE again did equally respect divergent opinions on PDA. So they recognise that some topic experts think that PDA can be adequately represented by breaking PDA down into its individual kind of components and giving individualised support based on that. So a bit of an idea of this. So this is a diagram from Liz O'Nyon's PhD thesis. And she's kind of done this here. So she's broken down into kind of 5 different its features can be broken into 5 different groups, and where they all kind of cluster together at quite severe end, it kind of represents Newton's kind of profile. But it kind of contains, as I said, kind of callous and emotional traits, conduct problems, hyperactivity, kind of emotional symptoms / anxiety, kind of autism features. This is another Venn diagram, but this time by Richard Soppert, and he kind of shows PDA being a very niche overlap of various kind of accepted diagnostic kind of constructs, which I've kind of built on this diagram to kind of be more representative of the current literature base. I'm taking a more kind of inclusive approach to PDA. So I've got it with a kind of a SPIKY kind of profile, kind of overlapping it. So I think it's got kind of features kind of suggested literature from autism, ADHD, kind of atypical kind of opposition defiant disorder and conduct disorder, kind of trauma / developmental trauma and anxiety. There is some unpublished research that also suggests there's association between PDA and depression, which I did predict in 2019. So yeah, this is a brief history of viewing PDA as a common mental disorder. So it's noted in the editorial of Christie 2007 that PDA might be a form of attachment disorder or personality disorder. There's a NIONS investigated to see if PDA could be viewed as a disorder to both behavioural and cognitive levels. And she concluded that PDA can be represented as a kind of double hit between kind of autism features and kind of callous emotional features of the problems. But that is mentioned in the kind of previous kind of table. If I was to show you kind of here. So yeah, I'm going to go back to this one. So Christopher Gilberg's relatively important because he kind of suggests that PDA might be a new type of disorder, and that its kind of prevalence rates can be relatively high in certain populations. But there's a lot of debate around PDA and various kind of trauma-based disorders. So, like, is it a form of attachment disorder, or is it features can be seen in those with attachment disorders or personality disorders? Which is a consistent kind of theme in the literature. There is some empirical evidence to suggest PDA is seen in non-autistic people, and there is quite a few kind of topic experts saying that PDA is seen in non-autistic people in print. So this isn't just a small thing. So yeah, I'm going to move on to the next one. This is an image from Rhodes in 2021, kind of showing the DSM-5 autism spectrum disorder criteria in kind of a bit of detail, and I find it quite interesting because if you look around the edges of it, so from here, from like kind of epilepsy, kind of ADHD, all the way around to kind of OCD kind of features, a lot of these issues, kind of conditions / features, characteristics, or traits, are basically what's represented in PDA. So you can actually map out how PDA's features would compare to the autism 5 criteria. So I've done that in the next diagram, and I come up with something that looks like this. So you've kind of got the DSM-5 autism at the bottom, so you've got kind of social communication issues, kind of the RRBIs on the right-hand side, and at the top you kind of got the kind of PDA from the aggregated profile. So you've got the kind of small atypical social interactions, and then you've got the kind of hyperactivity, kind of social manipulation issues. Social manipulations kind of take it outside of autism, because autistic persons are not meant to be manipulative. Also, anxiety again is not an autism feature, so that's kind of in there. Kind of the obsessive behaviour, kind of fancy role play elements are meant to be not seen in autism clinically. So these kind of suggest that PDA represents its own kind of distinct clustering of features, which I think is quite a valid kind of comment. So yeah, what these four schools of thoughts matter? It matters if one critic engages PDA. It seems to be clear that it's not a form of autism. I think that's quite blatantly obvious. In my view, the other three schools of thought are valid in some form, and so that, I mean, one can quite reliably and quite validly kind of view PDA to be either a kind of a common mental disorder or a kind of pseudo-syndrome or kind of rebranded autism. So yeah, it's also quite important because like most autistic people do not want autism itself to be divided. And if you get into the arguments around kind of clinical need for PDA, then most of the arguments are equally applicable for diagnosing PDA in non-autistic people, and they would have the same rights to diagnosis, research, and support. And there's kind of a more pertinent question I'm asking, which is how would you feel about autistic persons creating a disorder that pathologizes your non-compliance in creating an autism-friendly world and lack of empathy towards us? So yeah, these are just some kind of reflective points. Kind of more of a practical aspect. So yeah, the wording of the features that you kind of use to describe PDA matters because the individual wording can have different clinical interpretations, and the kind of wording around it in the different diagnostic in a different behaviour profiles have been changed to become more autism and to be more reflective of autism understanding. So, for example, if you look at the kind of one from Newton's one, which is the strategies of avoidance or essentially social manipulative, autistic persons are not meant to be manipulative in nature. So it's kind of evolved into quotation marks, so that their social avoidance strategies are kind of socially manipulative. To then kind of fully going to the person uses social strategies as a part of the avoidance, easy distracting, giving excuses. So the entire connotation that the avoidance strategies are socially manipulative has just been dropped in one of the versions of the behaviour profile. So it's just something to be mindful of, that you need to be quite specific on which traits you're using, and also which axology you use, and kind of how your assumptions around PDA will obviously inform how you design your studies, how you analyse your data, and how you interpret your data. And it has led to some really weird results, viewing PDA to be part of the autism spectrum. So what tends to happen is that if you think it's part of the autism spectrum, people will locate the issues associated with PDA to be rooted to deficits located within the individual showing the PDA features. And this has led to some weird results in the literature. So for example, DDAQ is the main screen tool for PDA for use. It's an observer-rated tool to be used with children and young persons showing PDA features. So one of the things that's done is, so the features that for the items that are assessed for comfortable role-playing pretend, they seem not to cluster with the demand avoidance traits. And this is a problem because if you take a transactional count to PDA, so and that the demand avoidance itself is a transactional process, theoretically these comfortable role-play and pretending traits should cluster with the other demand avoidance traits, because the comfortable role-playing and pretending traits should be representing a person disassociating away from aversive demands. There's another example. There's quite a few other examples that lead to kind of weird results and kind of other problems in the literature. But another one is kind of interpreting kind of anxiety-based avoidance features as social communication issues, such as in Eaton and Weaver 2020. I would point out that the study authors of that research would contest our view, but kind of the reasons why it's kind of important too. So yeah, often kind of professionally and ethically, researchers and practitioners should be not portraying PDA as part of the autism spectrum for reasons such as to not discriminate against non-autistic persons with PDA, but also to kind of give, they must be providing balanced and accurate information to kind of service users and caregivers that may want or need. And this, and I'm specifically referencing the Healthcare and Professions Council, which is the regulator in the UK for various kind of practitioners, but that includes kind of like psychologists and occupational therapists and speech and language therapists. So these are going to be including a lot of people who are kind of in practice diagnosing PDA or working with people with PDA. Also, kind of like ethically, we should be providing balanced and accurate information. And also, ethically, researchers should be tempted to falsify their hypothesis, not condone research that intrinsically favours one outlook over another. It should be open to multiple possibilities. So we shouldn't be conducting research that only uses to be part of the autism spectrum. Yeah, this is also another kind of important reason. So if you're only giving information which shows PDA to be part of the autism spectrum, some persons are strongly identifying with PDA as a form of autism, and some of these people do not like people critiquing that notion or challenging it. So more recently, I have had some quite severe abuse online against, because this is one of the memes about it. I'm not going to read it out. It's just kind of quite clear that how you portray PDA can have quite material consequences in real life. So yeah, I'm going to go into my overview of how I portray PDA. So in order to do that, I'm going to say that I'm encouraging from the outlook that it's a common disorder. So what does a kind of modern disorder look like? So for one, they lack any kind of biomarker evidence that can be used to identify them or diagnose them. Modern disorders are heterogeneous in nature and often with porous boundaries, and most of them have features that overlap other disorders, and most disorders are spectrum in nature. So yeah, and it's possible for disorders to have conflicting evidence over which diagnostic groupings they should belong in and how they should kind of be conceptualized. For example, ADHD could have been placed into the same diagnostic grouping in with oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder problems. So, yeah, what I'm trying to say is it can be problematic and not clear cut for where a disorder is meant to belong. Other point to point out is that it's argued to no longer be sensible to strive for to have homogeneous subtypes within disorders. DSM-5 is quite clear that it's problematic in to work out where a disorder becomes kind of pathological in nature in many people. So most disorders within the DSM-5 will have a term that's a variation of this one, which is basically disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of function. And these are kind of or terms and not ands. So it's actually quite broad and quite low. I'd also kind of point out it's worth comparing PDA's history to kind of autism history, because autism history can indicate what can happen to PDA. So, for one, it's often argued by Phil Christie in his talks and kind of article in scholarship on PDA that PDA is kind of X years or X decades behind autism. But I would argue that autism history can indicate that PDA can change diagnostic groupings and can be substantially broadened. So, for one, that we know autism changed diagnostic groupings because it used to be viewed as a form of schizophrenia, and that we know that its prevalence rates have risen quite substantially. So, originally from 1 in 2,500 to now to be 1 in 100 about, or it can be higher. Obviously, autism has been broadened into a spectrum. The DSM-4 notes that out of the 3 accepted autism subtypes from like 10, 20 years ago, that the residual category, pervasive mental disorder, not otherwise specified, is the most commonly diagnosed one, which is something I find quite interesting. More presently, autism has been viewed as a spectrum with different levels of support. So from like level 1 is kind of viewed as being Asperger's, and level 3 can be viewed as being quite severe support needs in nature. But that should be viewed as not being fixed, so people's support needs can fluctuate over time and in different situations. It's also now accentuated that high functioning autism is equivalent to Asperger's, and that there is negligible differences between Asperger's, high functioning autism, and kind of other subtypes within autism. So, yeah. So this is going to go to my kind of diagnostic threshold, which I use in my which I'm currently working with for PDA. So, we should know that the kind of PDA kind of should present as a continuum in the human population, because that's how disorders should present. We know that kind of features associated the kind of mental disorders kind of should present as continuums, and they should be fluid and transient and change over time in different situations. So if he uses generic threshold of the disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning, and you apply that to PDA literature, you should come out with PDA becomes pathological demand avoidance when a person starts to display avoidant behaviour and challenging behaviour in response to a particular stressor. So that's from Eaton 2018. There's other kind of areas, so it's either around the threshold for the extreme demand avoidance questionnaire, and or when the demand avoidance becomes kind of problematic in nature. So these are the kind of core traits that I'm using and with my wordings for them. So I'm trying to kind of depathologize, or to make the kind of wording, the terminology around PDA in how I use it to be quite neutral in nature. The left-hand side is basically if the feature should be universal. Basically, are they all essentially required for a diagnosis? I'm saying no, and I'm using News and Tells statistics for them. So, yeah, I'm viewing PDA to be about stress management and kind of transactional in nature. So, a person becomes stressed when the demands of their environment, or kind of internal, external, basically when the demands exceed exceeded the resources of a person's coping mechanisms, is when a person becomes stressed. So because a person can find the situation taxing, so the way in which you kind of the way you reduce some of the stress is that you improve their coping mechanisms. Essentially, is the way that you try to do that. You try to do that over time. So yeah, it has been hypothesized that kind of a result that's been replicated about 7 times in pediatric literature is that the PDA features in children and young persons decrease as a person kind of becomes an adult or how they mature over their kind of childhood. So it's argued that a person presents less PDA features over time in this case because they're basically learning better coping mechanisms. Well, it's hypothesized anyway, which is actually in line with what Andy McDonald would argue that if you want to reduce some stress levels, they develop better coping mechanisms. So yeah, 2/3 of distress behaviour are triggered by demands or questions by others. So kind of problem behaviours such as non-compliance, defiance, leaving an area, stereotypy, kind of self-injury, aggression, can be kind of caused by a person being stressed or kind of aversive demands. And it can be triggered by a person finding something situation aversive or uncertainty or kind of transitioning from one preferred task to a lesser preferred task. And yeah, the stress behaviours associated with PDA kind of exist over a continuum, and I'll kind of get onto those in a minute. So this diagram from the PDA Society, one of their kind of leaflets over how they kind of view PDA as part of the autism spectrum. I'm not entirely happy with this diagram, but it's kind of good enough to kind of show loosely what can happen. So a person doesn't necessarily have to go sequentially through these. They can escalate kind of very quickly up the levels. I'm not happy with it just being viewed as panic at the top. I think you should be viewing it as a person becoming increasingly highly aroused, with the kind of more behaviours are kind of showing, because they go from kind of relatively less extreme, and I'm using that in kind of quotation marks, extreme, or less kind of challenging or difficult for others to deal with, and for the person themselves to kind of manage and regulate. So you go from kind of distracting excuses through to kind of incapacitating, kind of disassociating, to kind of taking control, to kind of full on kind of like panic attacks, kind of violence, aggression, self harm, and yeah, like I'm fully sympathetic to those persons who display kind of PDA features and for those around them, because it can be quite difficult for every party involved with it to kind of deal with and manage and regulate the kind of features associated with PDA. So, as I said, the behaviours can escalate in severity until a demand is removed, and they can kind of escalate quite quickly. So it looks like that demand avoidance process works in a cycle that looks like this. So this is an image taken from Liz and I's kind of research update 2019. So you kind of have the demands, then they have the kind of avoidance escape behavior, then they kind of get they get some alleviation from the anxiety they have from a kind of versus demand, and this kind of process can kind of generalize over time and can become cued to kind of other responses. So this is another diagram by Liz and Ions, which is kind of published elsewhere. So yeah, so you have a demand, and it can be from something that a child wants to do. So they kind of have some kind of anxiety or stress. They kind of get some kind of, they find it aversive. They kind of do some kind of avoidance behaviours to get rid of it, and when they kind of have the demand taken off them, they get some kind of alleviation from the anxiety or distress, and it kind of negatively reinforces. Yeah, not sure what I was going to say about that. So this is how I've done. I've kind of built on this model and kind of semi-adapted from the OCD cycle, but this is a cycle that is common in the broader mental health literature. So a person will have a kind of demand, either internal or external. They'll have some kind of anxiety, distress. They will kind of do some kind of avoidance or rational, some kind of avoidance behaviour, which is either rational or irrational in nature, and they get some kind of temporary relief, and that kind of negatively reinforces it. What can happen is that the reduction in anxiety that a person experiences can reduce over time, so that the avoidance behaviours become less effective over time. So the anxiety can become pervasive because the avoidance behaviours aren't really working. But the point that we need to note is that the avoidance behaviours, their purpose or their function is to force other people to either change the environment around the person so it's less aversive, or to stop socially interacting with them. or to alter how they're socially interacting with them. So it's kind of moves on to how I'm currently modeling PDA in a kind of three-dimensional way, continuums in there. So you've got a continuum for kind of manipulative to strategic behaviors. So this is kind of important. So when you kind of close down here, it's a person's kind of more lowly aroused, kind of more manipulative, and it's kind of more strategic at this end. So it can be viewed as more compulsive, more lowly aroused, so more highly aroused. So in kind of the intensity of the stress behaviors. So what I mean by that is kind of you kind of go from down here. So towards the bottom, towards zero, you kind of have calm, kind of more high. You kind of go kind of agitation, shutdown, kind of self harm would be kind of the higher end of that kind of arrow. And this one is purely just how often they are kind of showing the kind of demand avoidance features. And obviously there's a diagnostic threshold, which I've kind of mentioned before. So yeah, we're pretty much at the end of the talk now. So these are kind of things I'm going to mention that people kind of, when they're kind of reading and talking about PDA, they need to be kind of quite clear about. So, like, what school of thought are they kind of basing their kind of assumptions of PDA upon? What certain definition of PDA they're using? The kind of exact behavior profile they're using, particularly as the wording, different versions have different clinical interpretations. You have to be quite clear about that, and also what kind of their exact threshold for PDA is. And in the game is kind of thought-provoking kind of question down the bottom, which is, how would you feel about autistic persons kind of creating a disorder that pathologizes your non-compliance in creating an autism-friendly world and lack of empathy towards us? So, yeah, most of the kind of points in here I've kind of made elsewhere or kind of seen elsewhere in my work or all in different videos and stuff. So I kind of encourage you to go away and kind of look at those if you need to. These are potential. I've got slides for potential discussion topics, which I'm not going to cover in this video, but I'm potentially will cover in the actual talk on the 18th. But I'm going to just show the slides for a few seconds each, so people can kind of pause the slides if they want to. But these are kind of discussion topics. So from like why it's problematic for VMPA to be a profile of autism, to like why Nielsen's diagnostic constructs are problematic fitting into accepted clinical practice. Problems with DAP conforming to its definitions of a pervasive developmental coding of disorder, to the kind of clinical arguments of PDA, to PDA's controversies, to example exercises for the demand management cycle. So these are links to other resources if people want more specific information on things. I'm not going to loiter on this page for too long. It should be quite self-explanatory. So these are my contact details. So like my Twitter handle, my email address, and my ResearchGate has the vast majority of my research outputs on. So the only questions kind of comment is for the actual talk itself. So these are kind of just this is the same slide as kind of previously. It's just here to kind of give pointers towards different kind of topics over it. So I said I'm not going to linger on the kind of the next bunch of slides that long, and it's going to be there for people who want to kind of pause the video to kind of go and take notes on them. So yeah, I'm also not going to be talking or kind of narrating these slides. So yeah, I'm intending to make a video for December, basically covering these definitions and the next batch of slides critiquing these definitions and PDA kind of conforming to these definitions. But I'm not going to narrate them now. I'm going to do that like next month. Yeah, we're almost getting to the references, so. Again, this is just a slide with links to kind of further resources if people wish to kind of access them. So this first slide with references on. Again, I'll be changing the slides every few seconds, so people can kind of pause them if they wish to kind of check specific references out. Are 12 slides with the references on. And the next slide is the last one. So thank you for your time, and I hope you have found this a useful video.